Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for starting your day with us. Welcome to the 14th annual Fox Cities Book Festival and our first event of the day, Grimm Tales, How Dark Fairy and Folk Tales Have Influenced Modern Literature. You are in for a treat with the panel that the festival has put together for you today, so thank you again. We're so happy to have you here with us virtually, but know that we do look forward to meeting with you in person next fall. The Fox Cities Book Festival continues to be offered free for all of our community members. Today's program will be available for viewing after our live event on the festival's Facebook page. So if you miss any portion of today's event or want to share it with your friends or family, direct them to the festival Facebook page to watch it there. The Fox Cities Book Festival is organized by a group of dedicated volunteers and community partners, including our public libraries, school districts and universities, bookstores, and individuals giving of their time and talents. We are able to provide these great events without financial barrier thanks to our generous donors and sponsors. They understand the value that access to the arts have on individuals, our students, and the greater Fox Cities community. If you too think that supporting local authors, building an engaged community of readers, and introducing our students to authors while bringing free educational and arts programs into our community, we encourage you to support the festival however you are able. You'll see on the screen in front of you a number of ways that you can donate. We still have 2 full days of the 2021 festival happening, but the 2022 festival is already being planned. So if you would like to ensure that that can really come to its fullest potential, we encourage you to make a donation. If you're interested in volunteering or supporting the festival in another way, reach out to us at the email indicated on your screen. We do ask that during today's presentation, our audience act as good digital citizens as we are in a virtual space, respecting all of our speakers and each other, following the code of conduct that you see on your screen. Any harassment or disrespectful behavior or language will be cause to remove you from today's event. During the presentation, our authors will be engaged in conversation, but you will have opportunity to ask questions as well using the Q&A function in Zoom. So the chat box will be disabled for our audience, but you can submit your questions through the Q&A box. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as time allows. And those of you that are joining us on Facebook, type your questions or comments into the comment section on the Facebook Live video, and we'll transfer those over to Zoom for our authors. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the host for today's event, Sarah Reed. And Sarah, thank you for bringing all of these authors together for us as well.
Well, thank you, Angela. I'm very excited to have brought these authors together.
I have a whole introduction to read for you.
Oh, okay.
Too. Sarah is a dark fiction writer in the frozen north of Wisconsin. Her short stories can be found in various places, including Ellen Datlow's Best Horror of the Year, volumes 10 and 12, and in her short fiction collection, Out of Water. Her debut novel, The Bone Weaver's Orchard, won the Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement in a First Novel and the This Is Horror Award for Novel of the Year. And the Spanish translation of the book is a finalist for the Guillermo del Baskerville Award. And when she's not staring into the abyss, she works with me as an amazing librarian and knits. So Sarah, thank you again for bringing us all together today, and welcome to all of our authors.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to introduce our panel of authors today. We have Carina Bissette, Gwendolyn Kiste, Steve Toase, and Mercedes M. Yardley. So if you guys want to turn on your cameras and join us. It's so fantastic to have you all here today. So to start with, if we just want to go around the panel, we start with Gwen, then Steve, then Mercedes and Carina, and just introduce yourselves, your work, and where your work can be found.
All right, I'm Gwendolyn Kiste, and I'm the author of the Rust Maidens, Boneset Feathers, Intersmile Will Untether the Universe, Invention of Ghosts, and my next novel, Reluctant Immortals, will be out next year from Saga Press. And you can find me online at my website, gwendolynKiste.com.
I'm Steve Toase. I've got a short story collection called To Drown in Dark Water out now from Undertow Press. I write mainly short horror fiction. But I also write for Folklore Thursday and the magazine 14 Times. And you can find me online as Steve Toase all over the place.
I'm Mercedes M. Yardley. I write horror, dark fiction. I wrote Little Dead Red, Pretty Little Dead Girls, a novel of murder and whimsy. And my next novel, Darling, is coming out next summer. And you can find me mercedesmyardley.com.
I'm Carina Bissette. I write fantasy, dark fantasy and fairy tales. I just finished, we have a book coming out, Shadow Atlas, so I'm an editor as well. Shadow Atlas, have to show it off. You can find me online at carinabissette.com.
That's fantastic. And we are still hoping that Rose Dabo will be joining us soon, at which point we'll introduce them as well. But we'll go ahead and get started in the meantime. So I was thinking maybe we could talk about our earliest exposure to fairy tales and folklore. So what stories came into your life early that stuck with you and that you can still think back and remember today?
I'd like to take that one. My dad used to travel a lot and he'd bring back books of fairy tales from different places. And the first one that I remember reading was Bluebeard, because it was so terrifying, and just being a little girl and being like, oh my gosh, there are dead women everywhere. That's kind of dark. And my father's like, I'd like to introduce you to maybe some of these other sweet tales. And it was Bluebeard, straight up. Can't let that one go.
My introduction was quite dark as well. So I remember having a storybook of fairy tales and folklore from around the world, and there was Baba Yaga in there, which is just terrifying. And
Nice.
it was the version where she flies across and babies die in the shadow of the mortar and pestle. But there was also in there Allinham's The Fairies, which talks about over the Airy Mountains down the Rushy Glen. And there's an area of my hometown that was known as the Hairy Mountains or the Airy Mountains. So immediately start connecting that folklore and those fairy tales to the landscape, which feeds into sort of some of my other interests. So that started very young.
For me, I'm sure that the first exposure was probably Disney cartoons, but my parents, being very morbid, told me right away with like Cinderella. They're like, this was based on Grimm fairy tales, and like the birds come and peck out the stepsister's eyes at the end. Like they told me like right off, like, okay, like these are like the sweet versions, but here's what really happened. And I remember being like, what? And like I didn't understand how like you could have these like really sweet Disney versions, but then the originals were so scary. And I was like little when The Little Mermaid came out, and then my parents are like, yeah, she dies at the end. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Like I remember going into a bookstore and finding a copy of The Little Mermaid and actually verifying that yes, she does indeed die at the end. And I'm like, what is this? This is terrible. And being very disturbed at a very young age, especially with the disconnect between like what I felt like I was being told by like, pop culture and what the actual stories were. So that was very, very enlightening and disturbing at a young age.
I started with Grimm. I have my family, we were pretty poor, but we had this companion library and it had all the books. I have it downstairs, but it was Grimm's and Anderson and Arabian Nights, but they were written for children. It's a children's companion library, and it fell apart. I read it so many times, binding's completely gone. So I used to go to the library quite often, and then I found the real tales. And my mother, being who she is, didn't realize what I was actually reading. So I got away with it at like 6 and 7, reading the stories of mutilation and horror, which it seemed real to me because it made sense of the world. It made sense. The world made sense that way. When I found out that it was Snow White's mother who wanted to eat her heart and not her stepmother, I'm like, well, that makes more sense. So it was that being able to connect with the real world and the things I was living with. Predominantly Grimm was my favorite.
Yeah, there's a theme here. And my early introduction kind of mirrors a bit of Gwen's and Carina's, where, yeah, Disney was kind of the first introduction, but then my grandmother gave me a book of the original tales, and it was illustrated. And of course, I don't think she even really knew what she was handing me. Neither did my parents. So I just got to look through all these illustrations of this and read the original tales. And yeah, how huge impact, because it's fascinating and it does help us make sense of the world, definitely. So how do you think that those early exposures influenced your work? Like, do you see those themes and settings and imagery coming forward in your work today?
Well, yes, I write dark. The darkness of the fairy tales always attracted me, and that's kind of what I've always focused on. I hate the super sanitized versions because they're just so unrealistic. I like protagonists that really struggle. I like protagonists that, have to really overcome things and not just like, oh, I can't find a pretty dress, the real darkness of it. And I find that coming through in mine.
Definitely.
Yeah, you're like, yeah, you're dark. Yeah.
Yep. I agree with everything you just said about your work.
I teach fairy tale workshops at the Storied Imaginarium. I take fairy tales and I look at all the different variations, and then I pull cultural things or social things or scientific things, and I combine and mash them up, like the Pied Piper and viruses. And so I just love those connections with history and society and culture, and they're in everything I write. Fairy tales, folklore, and myth. I haven't written a single thing that is not loaded with it. And if it's not right in your face, it's retelling, which I don't really do very often. It's the symbolism that I like to pull in. And it's in everything. It's in my poetry. It's in my nonfiction. It's in my fiction. It's everywhere.
Definitely. And I'll plug Carina's workshops too. If you're looking for great fairy tale and folklore workshops, look her up.
It's so exciting. They're all publishing so much more than I am. Like in all the big magazines. It's a lot of fun. Yeah. Thank you.
I mean, I think folktales influence the tone very much of my work, and bringing in various elements of the bar jest and the woods. The sort of having a bit of a pagan background. The woods are often seen as this magical place, and they're terrifying if you're there at dusk. Those transitional times when your eyesight's going slightly and you start seeing things through the wood, it can be very terrifying. But I think there's also a structural way that fairy tales influence me, which is I write a lot of flash fiction, and with fairy tales there's no backstory. You're straight in and you've got to sell the setting and the character very, very quickly, and that's something that I find coming through in my work as well. But also things like Alinem, I wrote a story about Bridget who lies on the flag leaves at the bottom of the lake, and sort of what the parents' experience of that would be like. So yeah, those early stories definitely feature very heavily in my work.
Yeah, mine's kind of a combination of everything we've said so far. I actually do a lot of retellings. I've done retellings of Little Red Riding Hood, of Baba Yaga, of Firebird's story, I think Snow White. So I love doing retellings, but then also in the structure. Even my novel, The Rust Maidens, I've always kind of thought of it as a fairy tale. It's like, instead of it being a forest, it's this industrial landscape, but it has a lot of the same kind of going into these areas that we think we know, but then once you get into them, they're sort of unfamiliar landscapes. And yeah, and I also love what Steve just said. One of the things I think is really fun about doing retellings or working with fairy tales is you don't have to go into as much backstory. You come into it and we kind of, they're such mythic stories, we recognize them instantly. And so that's a really nice thing as a writer. You don't have to be like, oh, now I have to establish all of these things. You can get right into the heart and the theme of what you're going for. And especially with flash fiction, that can be really pivotal in being able to use that medium. And so that's such a great way of using flash fiction and fairy tales. So I love them. I think they're so much fun, right? Like, we all recognize them, and it's such like this kind of like collective unconscious that we're all drawing from. Like, fairy tales are everywhere, and folklore, and it's so much fun as a storyteller.
Yeah, and you see that collective unconsciousness coming through in these, multicultural versions of almost identical stories that independently sprung up around the world. And I know, like, Carl Jung goes into the whole, we all have this collective unconscious of these stories, but I also kind of wonder if it's just a collective human experience and emotions and tropes, and who wouldn't be afraid if they suddenly realized they didn't know where they were really, so I love how those kind of come forward in every culture. So do you have favorite favorite retellings or favorite versions of some of the common fairy tales that have had an impact on you?
I'm going to go with Angela Carter before anybody gets her before me, because then I'll just be echoing what everyone else says.
We can have an Angela Carter, fan party real quick.
That was the first time, and it wasn't until I was in college that I discovered her, and I was just kind of floored. It wasn't even assigned. It was in like one of these, literature books for a literature class, and it wasn't assigned, but we were allowed to write about, any story that wasn't assigned in the book. And I picked it because I knew it had been based on, I knew a movie, the Neil Jordan movie, The Company of Wolves. I'd never seen it at that point. And so I read the story and I'm like, what is this? I'd never seen anything quite like that before, such that I could recognize the story so clearly. This was Little Red Riding Hood, but it was such a different approach. And I just remember it floored me. And I feel like, I haven't been the same since. And it's a very short story. It's almost a flash piece. I think it's about 1,200 words. And yet I remember being like, this is so different than anything I'd ever come across. So yeah, Angela Carter all the way.
So we're talking about authors, right? The authors?
Or retellings.
Retellings, but you can talk about whatever.
No, I just want to make sure I was on the right. Retellings, I'm working on a Cinderella story. Basically, I just wanted someone to eat a dead person's ashes. So I've been doing a lot of work with that. And I was reading a lot about Cinderella. It's one of our old stories, right? And I think it's the symbolism that really draws me to it. So if you look at Yishen, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but that was the first one that was written down in China quite a while, a couple thousand years ago. And there's some elements that keep following through. And one of them is the shoe, right? And so when you say shoe, when we say glass shoe, which is pearl, right? It's it's Cinderella, right? It's a rags to riches. And even that original one that Yishen wrote, that Cinderella, that first variant that they have written down, it's a gold shoe. Well, there was foot binding in China, right? And then there's wishes, but they're a little bit different. You have the magic fish bone. When you take the magic fish and you can go and find the salmon, there's links to all these motifs, these ideas, they link. You'll find them in all these different cultures. You're going to find this similar kinds of things. So the animals, the symbolism of animals, and the symbolism of the objects, the apple, right? I mean, it's in mythology and it's in fairy tale, and or the kingfisher's cloak, donkey skin. You have incest, and so the animal transformation, being able to hold that cloak over you, and it goes through all these different places. And I really love that so much when people take that. And Angela Slatter is doing some brilliant work with that. She's created her own universe, her own world. And so all the fairy tales are new and original. They're nothing you've really seen before, but they all feel very familiar because they're pulling on some of those ideas. And then she continues to build that universe, which is really quite brilliant. And so the Tallow Wife and Other Tales is her third one in the collection of stories, right? That all these stories, there's the Bitterwood Bible, the Sourdough, this one, and then her debut novel came out, All the Murmuring Bones. This is set in the same world as all of these books. So, but she's taking all that fairy tale and then creating something that's familiar, new. Yeah, I love it.
I mean, following on from that, I review comics. That's on my jobs for 14 times. And some of the best fairy tale work, I think, is coming through comics. And I know some people don't feel that's literature, but I do. But Emily Carroll's book, Through the Woods, which came out a few years ago, is absolutely astonishing, because even though they're not traditional fairy tales, they have that complete atmosphere and feel. They feel as if you've been reading them for years. And Sarah Gordon, I think it's Sarah Gordon's Vicious Creatures, which came out last year, is doing something very similar. But also, I think, that's the fairy tale side, but the folk tale side as well. So people like Jeanette Ng's Under the Pendulum Sun, which uses those motifs of folk tales about going to fairyland. And I don't know if anyone else has read this. There's a children's book called The Hounds of Morrigan by Pat O'Shea, which uses a lot of the Irish mythology. Again, it's very rule driven. So, the children are being chased by these hounds and they're fine as long as they don't run. And you read it and it feels like very, very old fairy lore. And I think that those are very, very powerful retellings.
I'm going to second Angela Slatter. When I read All the Murmuring Bones, and she references her own fairy tales that she had done, it's just beautiful and brilliant, and I just absolutely loved it. And also I wanted to say, when we're talking about symbolism, I love how fairy tales are like a shorthand. Like we can all understand something. Like if we see an apple appear, we know it's sinister. You know, we see this appear, we know that's magical. I love that in a way that we can condense down what we're writing without having to explain so much. Like someone pulls out an apple and you're like, ah, you know. And I was even watching this, there's this thing on Netflix right now that's like all the movie cliches. And they had somebody biting into an apple as a movie cliche. And it's like, when they bite into this apple, they're being like, they're flaunting authority because they're biting it in front of their boss, or, you know, they're being subversive somehow by eating this apple. And I thought that's so ingrained from fairy tales, and yet we don't even think about that, you know. So I love that.
Yeah, and that's a good mirror too, what you were all talking about. You know, we talk about the sense of thinking the woods are familiar and going into the woods and realizing you're in another world. Yeah, the rules have changed somehow, or something's different, something's uncanny. But we kind of get, when we read fairy tales, we get, even though it's brand new, we've never read this story before, it's a brand new story, instead it feels familiar. And so there's kind of this push and pull between the familiar and the unfamiliar in fairy tales and folklore. And how do you use that push and pull in your own work? And that sense of giving the reader something familiar and then pulling the rug out. And Gwen, I know you do this in Pretty Mary's a couple of times, so maybe you should go first.
Oh, put me on the spot.
Sorry.
I think, as we said, what's so interesting about fairy tales is the fact that they are familiar. So, I think even if you pull the rug out from under the reader, to a certain extent, they're almost expecting it if you're doing a fairy tale, because if you don't pull the rug out from under them, then you're just giving them exactly what they expect. And that can actually be even more disappointing as a reader if it's like, oh, I'm going to go into this, and yet, you know, you obviously already know the story of Snow White or these folk tales. And if you go into it and it's just that, then you're like, oh. So it's almost like this kind of like unspoken thing between the writer and the reader, that it's like, I'm going to do something probably different here. That's why we're here. So it's just a matter of maybe, hopefully, as a storyteller, picking the right time to do it and the right way of doing it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, hopefully I've done that in my work. Hopefully that's something I guess we all hope for, right? That like we figure out that right way of doing it and the right moment to do it, that it actually, you know. And again, you could even do it right at the beginning of a story. It could just be the entire setup is something different, or you can kind of go into it and it can feel familiar, like we said, until you get into the kind of middle of the woods, you know, the proverbial woods. And then that's when you kind of do that, almost like a magic trick, where you kind of flip the whole thing and do something unexpected.
Yeah, I mean, when that sense of danger comes in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think there's that other thing that you can do, especially with horror, when you're using these motifs in horror, is you can build inevitability. So rather than a jump scare, you build that feeling in the reader where they know where it's going and they can't change it, and they can see where it's developing and building that tension. And if you use the familiar motifs from fairy tales and folk tales, you're using that as a shorthand to help build that inevitability, you know, to the point where they know, you know, the outcome's going to be, but they can't stop it, which can in some ways be more effective than just, you know, a monster jumping out from behind a tree.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a novel called Pretty Little Dead Girls, a novel of murder and whimsy, and it's a fairy tale with a very high body count is basically what it is. And so I use some of the fun fairy tale, like there's a narrator, there's, you know, the flowers talk to her, just kind of some fun tropes like that. But the whole premise was whether this girl who's fated to be murdered, whether she's going to be murdered by this serial killer or escape. And for me, pulling the rug out, I didn't know until I wrote that chapter whether she was going to live or die myself. It didn't come clear to me. I just followed through that way. So when I got to the point where I was figuring out where the protagonist, you know, the pivotal climactic scene, and I still didn't know if she was going to live or die until I sat down and wrote it. And then I was like, oh, okay, so that's what happens, you know? So I think, you know, there's that inevitability, but there's also that area of like, you can do whatever you want. It's crazy. There's no logic in fairy tale land. It can be anything. And I love that magic, you know, that feeling of surprise, that feeling of anything can happen. You know, a fairy king can come down, you know, something can be obliterated. Like it's just, anything. And I love that. It makes it so broad. It makes it so magical. And I feel like you're not constrained to some of the things if you're writing strictly, strictly realistic fiction, having the stars come down and the moon come and take a bite out of somebody. I love being able to add that in.
I like that. That's a great story, by the way. I like I usually tackle fairy tales that piss me off. I'm a pretty angry writer. And so it's the things that make me upset that that's the reason I want to write those tales, and I want to rewrite them. So I wrote a story called Twice in the Telling, which is an Upon a Twice Time. It's a fairy tale. It's a murder ballad. And it's about it's two sisters. There's the dark one who, is the bad person, of course. And then there's the blonde one who's pretty and sweet, and she's the good one. And there's a prince, and the prince wants the blonde one. And so the dark one kills her sister. That stuff just pisses me off. I'm like, yeah, because of course women are reduced to fighting over a man to the point where you're going to kill your own sister. And then a harper finds her and turns her body into a harp. And then she tells the whole court that the bone harp tells the court that the older sister killed her. That makes me mad. And so it's like, well, what if we believe that whole story is about that whole idea, that narrative that keeps seeping through of women against women. So everybody says that that's what the real story is, but what if the real story is something a little bit different, right? And so I like to do that. And then I like to mash tales. So I'll take elements from different tales and blend them together to create something new and hopefully jarring. I like to upset people. I like to get them thinking. So that's what I do. I always flip them.
Yeah, and that's great too, that we can take these tales that have been around forever and say, hey, this was the message that was being told to children, to everyone for centuries, and let's subvert it. Let's take this message and say, no, this isn't the message we want. This isn't the message the world needs. So what are some of your favorite examples of stories that do that subvert the cautionary tales that are problems?
I'll start. So Kelly Link wrote an incredible story called Travels with the Snow Queen. If you haven't read it, you want to read it. I believe it's at Uncanny. I'll have to look it up. But she really hits that hard. She talks about the shoes and about, what the woman, it's a snow queen Gerda going after Hans. And it's just like, oh my God, it's so trite. And so she flips it. Amal El-Matar also did this with the Black Bull of Norway, and she mashed it with a couple of other tales. It's also about shoes, which is interesting. It's called The Seasons of Glass and Iron. It is an Uncanny. I'll post the link. It's so very good. And then Carmen Maria Machado does it as well. She is a folktale, one of my favorites. It's in her book, Her Body and Other Parties. And it's the husband stitch, which is all about the folktale about the woman with her head held on with a ribbon. And so she took that folktale, and it's like the subservient. She plays with all of those ideas. So she takes the stories that are familiar and then flip it. All three of those stories are just excellent examples, I think, of taking the stories, making it really familiar, and then flipping the script.
Definitely.
One of my favorites, and the title escapes me, but it's a story by Amy Bender. It's a short story, and it's the wife of the giant from Jack and the Beanstalk. And the giant, in his sleep, ate their children, and she's had enough, and she just leaves. She just divorces that. She just leaves him. She just walks out the door, and it's just this beautiful tale of this woman on her own after her husband did something absolutely unforgivable, and how is she going to recover from that. And it was so unexpected and just absolutely lovely. I'd suggest that one.
That's a good one.
Her Body and Other Parties is a great one. That's obviously everybody loves it. It's such a great retelling. The husband stitch is so creepy and so familiar. And I was, of course, thinking, because it was originally, I believe, in the Scary Tales books from when we were kids. I think that's the first place I ever came across that green ribbon story. So it was disturbing then, even though those were more kind of straight retellings. I don't think that maybe not even retellings, just kind of those were just the stories, put out there. But I thought that her take on it was definitely very, very disturbing, but also at the same time, again, like felt inevitable. Like we were saying, like this idea of like, that seems actually what's going on there. It's taking away her autonomy, and the way that story approaches it is sort of just saying what we kind of already knew, but bringing that to light. And I think that's always interesting with fairy tale retellings, is if you're saying something that is already clearly there, but maybe we've never said it aloud before, never allowed ourselves to think, okay, this is what the story's really about, or what it could very easily be about, and what we can see in it. So.
Well, just the title alone, The Husband Stitch, when I first heard of that, and was reading that story, like I was just tired upon the title alone. Like, I am just tired of all of this going on. And she just, oh, it's amazing. It's just amazing.
Amazing story.
I mean, I might be wrong. Isn't Seasons of Vastarien the one that Amal wrote, which focuses on the friendship as well? And she was saying she was trying to get more friendship, into fairy tale storytelling. But there's also at Rowan Head, which is actually a poem. It's by Robin Robertson, which is a retelling of it's a Selkie story. And it's about a wife whose husband realizes his children are more fish-like than human. And he kills the children, and then the lover comes back. And I can't remember if the wife's killed the husband or if he kills the husband, but then the wife gives the lover his sealskin back. So it's gender flipping all the tropes of the Selkie story. And it's also one of the most heartbreaking poems. There's video of him reading it on YouTube, and it is just devastating. It's a devastating piece, but it just turns everything around from the traditional Selkie story of a woman who has her seal skin taken and is then vulnerable. They're not vulnerable in that. She takes action, he takes action, and it's completely changes it around.
Yeah.
If we're going to talk about poetry, Anne Sexton's Transformation, you guys, you want to read them. They're brilliant. She flips that too. And then Carmen Maria Machado's The Women Who Were Skinned is another one. That goes from Bastille, The Tale of Tales. So a lot of those are really gory, and it's about the flayed woman story. And it's just, it's all talking about how women have to be beautiful and young to be women. And Carmen is pretty like twisty with that one.
And speaking of transformations and contemporary retellings, I edited an anthology a few years ago, and several of you are in it, called Gorgon, Stories of Emergence. That was it was a collection of contemporary retellings of the trope of transforming. And kind of, we talked about that earlier with that, putting on the animal skin essentially, and Selkies kind of fall into that too, where in so much of like Ovid's Metamorphosis, we see transformation happening as a result of assault or of a curse. And I wanted to see contemporary authors spin that and flip those tropes. Maybe it's an emergence instead. Maybe it's growth. Maybe transformation is good. Maybe it's tragic too. But transformation is one of the big fairy tale themes we see over and over again that keeps working as a metaphor and as a symbol in today's literature. So can you talk a little bit about your work or your favorite works that you've read that involve transformation?
The Tiger Bride, Angela Carter, is brilliant. It's a Beauty and the Beast. I'm not going to spoil it for you guys, but you want to read it if you haven't read it. And it influenced me when I wrote quite a bit, actually. It influenced me when I wrote Burning Bright for that anthology for Gorgon. It was a Tiger's Bride I was looking at, and I was also looking at Thea Obrett's The Tiger Wife, which is a novel. It's more magical realism. And then Amy Bender also wrote a story about a woman who's sewing tigers up. I think it's called Sewing Tigers. It's Amy Bender. So that whole the tiger thing, those are the three stories that influenced that particular piece I wrote. And I never thought anybody would buy it because the structure is just so strange and weird. But it was a lot of fun.
A lot of my work deals with, sorry, Mercedes, do you want to go?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. A lot of my work deals with transformations. My novel, The Rust Maidens, is all about transformations. All of the girls, and well, not all the girls, but 5 girls in Cleveland during the kind of Rust Belt era, 1980, transform into the rust and rot of the Rust Belt. And like I said, like I really thought, I think of that very much like a fairy tale, just like a kind of more modern fairy tale. And then the Gorgon story that I had in your anthology, that also has obviously a transformation theme. That one is, I have such long titles, and I used to get mad at my husband when he couldn't remember the titles of my own stories. And now that I have a few things published, I'm like, I can't always remember. It's Tips for How to Deal with Your Daughter When She's Become a Monster. And it's this little like teenage girl who's coming into this power that nobody realizes she has. And she finds out again at the, you know, this group of boys tries to assault her, and that's when she realizes she has this power. So again, like you said, it comes from this moment, this kind of trauma, and that's this kind of pivot point of when she's coming into this power that she can turn people into stone. And most of the time when I look across now that we're talking about this, I'm thinking across my work, it is usually this moment of trauma, this you know, people are dealing with something. And for me, the transformations usually aren't scary. I mean, they are scary perhaps, but they're transforming them into something that maybe is better for them, maybe something that gives them that power, gives them that agency that they didn't have necessarily. So yeah, I always see transformations being great. Like, even though it scared me as a kid when I found out like caterpillars turned into butterflies, once I realized, I'm like, yeah, this is cool. Transformation is neat. So I think maybe that started me on that path.
I wrote a story actually in one of Carina's workshops for Monstrous Women, which if you can take one of her workshops, just amazing. But I wrote a story called Urban Moon, and it's a take on the Swan Maiden tale, where, you know, these sisters, they're all out at a club and she takes off her jacket, and it's a story about sexual assault and rape culture, and it's videoed and put on the internet, and how people are like shaming her for, you know, being without her jacket. And, you know, and it's a story about, you know, power and sisterhood and becoming something more than you thought you were by having, you know, your sisters reach out to you and things like that. But I agree with Gwendolyn that I think transformation can be exceptionally powerful in times like duress and stress. And that's when you find out what you and what your characters are made of, is when something is just, you know, you've got to transform or you're just not going to survive. So I love that as a theme too.
Yeah, I think it's been decisive and being proactive and giving your characters that strength to do that, like you say, under duress. Same as story I had in Gorgons was Discarded Skins, where the wife is in a specific, it's a Selkie story. The wife's in a specific situation. You know, she's got a loved one who's suffering, and she takes very proactive, tragic decisions, but she does that because it's the only way that she can take back control over the situation. But she does it with the full knowledge of what's coming and what the outcome is. And I think that's very powerful. In some of the other stories, I mean, some of my stories are very fairy tale. So sorry, I do long titles as well. So I always forget my own titles. When why the sea tastes of salt and why the moon always looks towards us is about a witch who falls in love with the moon, but she takes very proactive action to manifest this love and this relationship, but it's very folkloric in the way it plays out. And yeah, but that decisiveness I think is really important in retellings.
Definitely. So one of my questions too is what reference materials do you keep on hand? What do you refer to over and over again when you're looking for this fairy tale and folklore inspiration? Do you have like a little collection of specific editions that you have, you know, worn out? I know, Carina, you showed us pictures of your worn out books earlier. So what are your favorite resources and sources of inspiration?
I mean, I have a whole bookshelf, but one of my favorites is this, which is the Dictionary of Fairies by Catherine Briggs, and that cover is so 70s and just so beautiful. The Leaping Hare, which is all Hair Folklore, which again is gorgeous, which is again a very old,
Ooh,
but it's
know that one.
absolutely amazing.
All right.
Over Nine Waves by Maria Heaney, and A Book of Irish Folk Tales, which has in one of my favourite ever folk tales, which is a visitor goes to a house and they say, well, we'll feed you, but you have to tell us a story. And he goes, I can't tell stories. So they kick him out, and then a series of events happen. And when he comes back to the house at the end of the night, they go, so have you got a story now? And then he's got his story to be fed. And, you know.
I keep a lot of books, you know, like the rest of us on a bookshelf. I also love illustrated editions, because that way, like if I am trying to like I love looking at art in general. I find it so inspiring, and it's made me sad over the last couple of years, last year and a half, of not really being able to go safely into museums. I've visited a couple since being vaccinated, but otherwise, you know, that's always such an inspiration for me anyways. And so I always love some of the illustrated editions, and especially like the weirder the illustrations, the better. Like I love sometimes, because I love that cover that you just showed, Steve, the real 70s one, the Dictionary of Fairies. I love that kind of stuff. I love things that can look dated or even kitschy now. I think that just kind of like opens up the fairy tales in a slightly different direction than maybe I would think of them. And so that's always nice. Like I keep lots of illustrated editions where I can just like open to a random page and see like what's speaking to me today.
Yes. I do that with Brian Froud's fairy books a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Love his artwork. Sometimes I don't even need to read a word, just flipping through. I'm like, all right, there we go. That's the face I needed.
I find that I tend to go back to the stories that I read as a child. Like I have the old tattered books, you know, there's one that's a fairy tale for every day of the year, you know, and so I go and look at those, and it's ones where the bindings are just, you know, coming off. And one of my favorite ones is this old children's tale, but it talked about Sleeping Beauty. And my favorite thing that it talked about in that whole story was how everyone, you know, they knew that she was going to be killed by a spinning wheel. So they all burned their spinning wheels and threw away their spinning wheels, and everyone's wearing these like hand patched clothes, and how proud they were to show their support and love for the princess by wearing these like tattered clothes, and how it was a thing of pride. And that just stuck with me through everything. But that and an old illustrated Grimm's tales where the pictures are just horrific. That's another one I would go back to. Yeah.
We might have had the same one. Yeah.
Probably. We're traumatized forever. Yeah. But so good.
Yes.
I have 4 cornerstones for you guys. The first one is Myth and More by Terry Windling. Terry Windling is brilliant.
Yeah.
Her website is a veritable treasure trove of essays, and so I'll put the link in. Marina Warner, this is probably my favorite. This is Beast to Blom by Marina Warner, and it talks about fairy tales. It's pretty extensive. It's a really great book. You can get it for a really good price. Then there's Jack Zipes. You have to have, if you're going to do Jack Zipes, anything by Jack Zipes is wonderful. I met him once and started crying. This is my favorite, The Irresistible Fairy Tale. I'll put the links up, by Jack Zipes. He also did the complete Tales of Brother Grimm. And then Maria Tater, she has a book, The Hard Facts of the Grimm Fairy Tales. I'll put it in the link. But she also had a new one come out, The Heroine with 1,001 Faces. And this book, you guys, is like super incredible. She took Joseph Campbell and flipped and is doing it from the women's point of view. It's gorgeous. And then if you want more, Wayne State University has a whole series called the Donald House Fairy Tale series. And so they have books like this. They're scholarly books. So if you're interested in scholarly, this is the reorienting of the fairy tale. But they have an entire series. You can sometimes find them on sale. And then the ones I use for my own writing is Traditional Symbols by J.C. Cooper. You can get this super cheap online, but it's great with the symbolism. And then this one, you just have to have it. The dictionary, Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable. The resources in here, it points you in all sorts of different directions, and you can start moving around with the themes and the tropes and the symbols and kind of float in between. So those are my favorite, and I'll put all the links in there.
And if I can just jump back in for a second, the Endicott Studio, which Terry used to run before she had her own blog, is amazing. There's still loads of resources there. And I'm very lucky because where we live in Munich, there's the International Youth Library down the road, literally about 3 miles down the road. And they hold one of the biggest collections of children's literature in the world. They also have a Michael Ende museum there. So they have a lot of those resources. And they had someone mentioned in the chat before we had this, Sean Tan's fairy tale book of the sculptures, and they had an exhibition of his work there, which was just stunning to see. They've had Chris Riddell's work there, which is, he's obviously done a lot with Neil Gaiman. So having that on the doorstep means I don't have to buy quite as many books at the moment, so I can go down.
My first poems were written for Terry Windling in my old name. I'm a domestic violence survivor, so I changed my identity, but I kept those two things because they were precious. Endicott Studios has poetry and nonfiction articles. Many of the nonfiction are on Myth and More, but yeah, it's an incredible site. Yeah. I'll put a link up to that too. And then D.L. Ashleman, if you want to look at variations of fairy tales, D.L. Ashleman has got an extensive site where you can look at a fairy tale and then look at all the different versions. It's brilliant. Yeah, it's great.
How about you, Gwen? Do you have some favorite childhood editions, or?
You know, I'm not sure if I have any specifically favorite childhood editions, at least not that I've brought with me, like, to our library. I'm sure there probably is something though, you know? Like, I still feel like most of the very early were probably like the Little Golden Book versions of the Disney cartoons. And you know, at the same time, though, as much as those are sanitized, they still scared me as a kid in their own way, because it was like, oh, you know, you're a little girl and guess what? You're going to grow up and all you're going to get to do is marry a prince. And that's like, oh my God, like even when I was little, like I wanted to like go on adventures. I wanted to have like an exciting life, and it did not seem very exciting to just go and just get married. And that was the entire, like, then you'll live happily ever after, whatever that means. I guess just being in stasis, which sounded like hell. So they were scary in a very different way for me, even though I loved the animation. I mean, I still think no matter what you want to say, that kind of era of Disney animation and like the 20th century was just beautiful. There's some beautiful animation in it. But at the same time, I was always like, this is terrible. This is so scary. It was a different kind of, like, it was much more of an existential terror for me as a child than maybe the Grimm fairy tales, which were much more overtly scary. But at the same time, I felt like, okay, if you can survive these, you can get away from the birds that are trying to peck out your eyes, or you can get away from Baba Yaga, then okay, like you're good. Whereas I feel like the so-called happy ending was something that was, again, like stasis, like that's all you were going to get to do. And it was that was so much scarier in a lot of ways for me, because it was like, you know, it seemed like that was the main narrative, even, you know, growing up in the 80s and 90s, it was still like the main narrative I felt as a little girl you tended to get, even though it's like, oh, you'll go to college, but like here, we're telling you to go to college, but we're also giving you these stories that like you're supposed to just go get married and have kids, and that's the extent of it. So the Disney cartoons were still scary to me, just for a very different reason than the Grimm brothers telling. So yeah,
definitely. I have a shelf of reference books too. There's an encyclopedia of gods, goddesses, devils, and monsters that also has a very retro cover. I don't have it here with me, but and then there's a new annotated original Grimm's fairy tales book that just came out a few years ago. That was really interesting because it does kind of go into more side sources and background, and maybe not as much as I was hoping it would when I heard that it was coming out, but it's still a really good jumping off point. So if you're looking for a good resource, especially on Grimm's tales, that's a good place to start, because it can take you down a couple different rabbit holes, and then you'll get lost in the woods, just like every child in the fairy tales. All right, well, we have 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure our audience has a chance to ask some questions. So you can, down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. You can tap that to open up the Q&A box and send any of our panelists questions. While we wait for questions to come in, if you all want to talk about what are you working on right now, and does it have anything to do with fairy tales or folklore? It's okay if it doesn't, but I still want to hear what you're working on.
I'm finishing up edits for my novel that's coming out next year, the one I mentioned, Reluctant Immortals, coming out from Saga Press. It is, it's not really fairy tale or folklore, but it is a retelling. It's Lucy Westenra from Dracula and Bertha Antoinetta Mason from Jane Eyre, and it's set in 1967, Summer of Love in California, as they're dealing with the toxic men in their lives, Dracula and Edward Rochester. So that's, again, retelling. I almost feel like those stories have become almost like fairy tales, though. Jane Eyre and Dracula have been retold so many times, and we've looked at them from so many different directions, and they almost become a mirror in the same way fairy tales are. Once, I would say the same thing with like Frankenstein and a lot of these kind of canonical books. They become their own kind of fairy tale, even if they don't sort of conform to exactly all the tropes of fairy tales. So it's a little bit like a fairy tale, a little bit.
I agree. I definitely agree. We're still writing our contemporary fairy tales. Every era has its tales. What about you, Steve? What are you working on right now?
So I've picked up a novel project which has been sitting around for a while, but this year I'm just finishing a project in Luxembourg for Esch Capital of Culture 2022, and it's going to be on an app, so it's walking around, it's site specific. But the area we've got is called La Sauvage, and the name comes from the savage woman who lived in the woods there and gave cures or gave poisons depending on how you treat her. And it's just fast. It's amazing folklore. So she had enough, so she lay down. There's a rock in the middle of the village. She lay down and the rock descended down on her and pushed her down to hell. And because of her appearance, because she had hair down to her feet and she had 2 rows of teeth, hell decided that she was more animal than human, and she had to dig her way back up to the surface. And I've written a series of pieces which will be, I've worked in collaboration with a musician called Eric Holm, and as you go around the area, these pieces will be triggered. These pieces I've written inspired by this, so trying to see it from her perspective. And there's actually some mythology nearby from an Iron Age hill fort, which I've actually tied in a little bit, which has a blonde-haired woman fleeing from there. So I've tied it together. So that's been quite fun to do.
I think I need a field trip.
Yes.
I need to go do this. We do have an audience question I'll throw out there. Carrie asks, how much do you feel that your environment, where you grew up or where you live now, has shaped your interpretation of fairy tales? And how have they developed into your own modern fairy tales?
I think my experiences, so I was homeless when I was 16, and I think fairy tales, and especially folk tales, feel like they belong to people who aren't necessarily rich. They're not tales of court, they're tales of a fight. You know, you read a lot of the Irish ones, they're tinkers, they're people down on their luck. So it gives us a mechanism for telling those stories, and for telling those stories in that place, and for generating folklore of our own about the places we live. So you adapt those, tropes, and you find ways of telling about your experience. So, Charles DeLint has written a lot about using folklore to tell stories about people who are homeless and experienced homelessness, and people who are migrant communities coming over, but especially for the homeless, that resonated. And so when I read the old Irish tales, and it just gives us those devices to tell our own stories, I think.
I grew up in the desert, and so a lot that really influenced how I think. Sorry, my daughter's blowing her nose right during this moment. You're okay. So I actually have the desert being the antagonist in a couple of my stories. Like, it prowls around, it leaves its footprints on your porch. It wants to kill you because it's such a harsh, hostile environment. So growing up there, I tend to use sense of place very much. It's what most of my tales are just kind of rooted in, is this sense of where you are shapes everything, because it's so true. When we lived in Seattle, that's very different than now living in Las Vegas. It's a very different environment, and it shapes the way you perceive things, and it shapes the way people around you act. And when we lived in Finland, they act this way towards their environment. And here, it's very different. Like, there, you were out in the environment all the time. Here, you're outside and the sun kills you. So I think place makes a huge difference.
Yeah, definitely.
For me, I grew up in a small town, so like forests and things seemed like so scary to me, and it was so like foreboding, and so I always was like, yeah, in fairy tales, of course you could get lost. And I did get lost in the woods once when I was like 16. It's like this legendary story in my family, because they've gone to like get the cops to find me, and I was only lost for like 20 minutes. Like, if you ask my parents, they act like I was lost for like 3 days. I was lost for 20 minutes. But then what's funny is now I actually live, and I met my husband, he already owned this piece of land. It's like about 30 acres, and we have a lot of trees and everything. And now I see the forest as potentially more protective, because it's like, if you know the forest and other people don't, then you can hide more easily, and it can kind of give you shelter. So that sort of shifted the way I sort of see the forest. You know, growing up, I was always like, oh my gosh, you know, it's terrifying. And now I'm like, yeah, I mean, it can still be terrifying. You need to respect it, especially if you don't know the terrain, but it can also be protective if you know at least a little bit about it. So that's kind of like a shift that's probably been reflected to some extent in my work.
So in Theodora Goss, if you guys aren't familiar, she has a wonderful blog, and she did a whole series called, I think it was Into the Dark Wood, A Heroine's Journey. And she was looking at the difference. It's again, Campbell, like the Maria Tater book. It's about how women's stories are different, and they tend to revolve around the home. They're more internal. And so for me, I tend to stick with interior landscapes, houses, and that sort of concept, rather than the outside world and the journeying outward to do things. It's more of a journey inward in my stuff. So there's that. And then I feel uncomfortable often writing about other people's cultures, but I do see writers who take stories that are familiar in the Western canon, like Bluebeard. Nala Hopkinson wrote a story called The Glass Bottle Trick, and it takes the Bluebeard story and puts it in the Caribbean. With varying degrees of blackness. So she takes the whole Oriental idea of Bluebird and flips it, and then talks about race and skin color, which she does. It's a brilliant story. It's in fantasy. I'll put the link on the side.
And that ties into kind of one of our other questions here on that we got from the audience is, how do you worry about cultural appropriation when looking into your source material? Because there's such a wealth of amazing mythology and folk and fairy tales from all around the world, from Carrie in the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like most writers, hopefully today, are at least thinking about that and trying to be as absolutely respectful as possible. For the most part, I tend to focus more on the folklore and mythology from my own heritage, my own background. You know, but that's certainly, there are writers who don't do that and who branch out further than that. It's just a matter of being careful, I would say, and also realizing that if you're going to do that, then no matter how careful you are and how conscientious you are, there's going to be somebody who doesn't like it. And don't get angry at somebody if you took their culture. Like, I sometimes see people get very upset, writers get very upset about any kind of criticism of their work. But if somebody doesn't like it, no matter what you write, somebody's not going to like it, and you need to be respectful of those different opinions. And I would say, in particular, if you're writing outside of your culture, just be aware that there's going to be criticism and deal with that, and hopefully learn from it. I mean, I like to think that what we're doing as writers is we're kind of putting it out there as this larger literature, right? And it's all in conversation with each other, and you know, and the writers are in conversation with their readers, and hopefully, you know, we can all learn something, because we should never stop learning, right? Hopefully.
And we've got, with 1 minute left, we've got a yes or no question from the audience. We can go around. The answer is, do you ever scare yourselves?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I hope so. We know we're doing something right if we're scaring ourselves. All right, well, that brings us to our time, and I just want to thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful hearing all of your perspectives on fairy tale and your knowledge and your insights. You're all wonderful, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was fun.
Back over to Angela.
Thank you all so much. Sarah, thank you again for bringing us all together. And we had a request for a reading list of all of the books talked about. So we'll be in touch with everyone, and then look forward to that college course, as it was referred to on Facebook, posted on the festival page soon. So thank you again, everyone. The festival continues all day long. Visit Fox Cities Book Festival to get the full schedule and sign up for more. Have a great day.